Welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm Casey Scott, your host. My guest today is Roget Lockard, an addictions counselor. We've been having a series of discussions on the nature of addiction. Roget, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here, Casey.
Now, in our last program, we began a discussion of the 12 steps of recovery as originated by Alcoholics Anonymous. Mm-hmm. And I started that discussion by observing that the steps were written in the third person plural when I meant to say first person plural. So I just wanted to clear that up.
Yep.
And basically, the sense of that was that these are people sharing their experience.
Exactly.
So now there was another discussion that we had about around the beginning of the step one discussion in one of our previous programs about the addict having to exercise will in order to be abstinent when it was the will that had failed him in the first place. So I would like for you to pick that up just a little bit because I don't think that we really carried that through.
As I remember that exchange, and as I remember, Casey, there was some clumsiness on my part in indicating a segue from hitting bottom to the surrender that is intrinsic to step one. And so I think it was perhaps a little confusing for the viewers, but the critical distinction I think is very simple and at the same time very critical, very fundamental, and that is will has two manifestations in our behavior, in our orientation. Mm-hmm. And in very simple language, you could say one version is willfulness, mm-hmm. and the other is willingness. They both have the potential to be incredibly powerful, although one tends not to think of surrender, which is essentially what willingness, or it's one language that works well to evoke willingness. It just scares the bejesus out of people talking about surrender, in our culture.
Well, it is the opposite of willfulness.
It is. Well, it is one of the opposites. Another opposite of willfulness is resignation. So, which is kind of what's the word that I want? It's a relinquishing of striving, mm-hmm. in a sense. And that's an abandonment of the exercise of will, in a certain sense. But without getting too arcane or philosophical about this, that key difference between willfulness, which is so much the hallmark of, absolutely, of addiction. It is the essence, one of the essential features of addiction. But more than that, as we'll get into in future conversations, I expect, it's the hallmark of our culture. Mm. And so it's the most natural thing in the world. And the willingness, the healthy willingness that is a function of surrender, is uncharacteristically healthy in terms of our culture. So I think we'll be teasing that apart in with more nuance as we go along. But I'm glad you brought that up.
I expect so, and I'm glad to have that cleared up because it is a kind of a conundrum to think about abstinence being the prerequisite for recovery when it is the failure of the will that has got the addict mm-hmm. into the predicament mm-hmm. in the first place.
Well, and a word that you have very usefully kept coming back to in these conversations is ultimately it's about control. It's about that third aspect of human endeavor. You know, there's intent, there's effort, and there's outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And willfulness is about outcome, as is control. Willingness is about paying all the attention one can to the integrity of intent and effort, and then being in a state of surrender, of letting go of the results, because we can't insist on the results.
Right.
So letting go is emotionally, psychologically, tactically, however you want to think about it, by far the most fitting response.
And it is the attempt to control the outcome that gets the addict into the predicament in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And in a very we've covered these last time, but in
Yes.
a very meaningful sense, it is that letting go of insisting on the outcome that is a portal into step one.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to bring this discussion up to the point where we left it, I would like to sort of give a little bit of a summary of the first three steps, and in my own words. And I would say that the first step is coming to the recognition and acceptance of the fact of the failure of the addictive enterprise. The second step is the understanding that there is an alternative, and that alternative offers hope. And the third step is very simply to accept and commit to that alternative. Does that seem like a fair summary?
Very successful, yes.
Yeah, okay. Very good. Which brings us to step 4, which we only introduced in our last discussion and had no opportunity to talk about it. But I'm going to read it from the text, Alcoholics Anonymous. Let's see. Step 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And we concluded that discussion with a 2-part summary that you offered of the process of recovery through the steps.
Of the entire 12 steps,
yes.
With, again, characteristic modesty. And I really can't tell you where these things come from. They just
Experience,
emerge.
perhaps?
Well, no doubt. Experience, observation, a reflection, and I just have one of those kinds of minds. But that summary characterization of, again, the whole enterprise of sobriety goes like, part 1 is discover who you really are. And I see that as being conveniently the work of the first 6 steps. And then the second part is be faithful to that.
Okay. So there's a nice simple geometry here.
There is,
Yeah.
by happenstance.
All right. So actually we could boil the whole thing down to 2 words: authenticity and faithfulness.
Yeah.
So we're done.
We're done. Yeah. Good night, all.
No, actually, there's much more to be said about step 4. And the first thing that occurs to me is that this must be terrifying to most people when they first encounter it. Do you mean that I have to make a list of every single thing that I've ever done wrong in my life? Again, I'm sure that this is a major stumbling block. This must be a place where a great many people fail.
Well, it's a place, again, my take on addiction and sobriety is that the essential features of both are almost distractingly simple, because people from a whole range of vantage points, dig into them in ways that keep discovering levels of complexity. But my own preference, as I think you know, is to try to find the underlying simplicity that informs all of the intricate manifestations. And with regard to the fourth step, I guess the very first thing that I would want to say on behalf of that simplification agenda is an insight that came to me maybe 20 years ago, where I was visiting an AA meeting, and the speaker made the observation that if you find yourself struggling with one of the steps, you might be well advised to reflect, pay attention to your relationship with the step that precedes it. Mm-hmm. And I found that to be really a canny piece of advice in any case, but as you point out, the only step that competes with step 4 for its fearfulness, I believe, is the 9th step, where we go out and make amends to people that we've injured, but we're not there yet. Yes, people dread the 4th step.
Well, and largely perhaps because they're looking ahead to the 9th step.
Maybe. Although I think it tends to be widespread human attribute to not want to look at what might be called negative renderings of ourselves, negative images, negative assessments, and whatever. So a quick aside, it says a fearless and thorough...
Searching and fearless.
Searching and fearless moral inventory.
That's intimidating language to begin with, isn't it?
It sounds like it, but I want to offer the thought that fearless does not have to mean all gathered up with heroic armor and great dollops of courage that allow you to... Fearless, I think, in its more fundamental and ideally applicable role here, means letting go of fear. Letting go of the belief that there is something you're going to learn about yourself that is so appalling, that this kind of anxiety, this terror is called for.
Yeah.
And the gimmick that I was able to contrive from this gentleman's recommendation to look at the step before the one in question, which at step 3, of course, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of a higher power. So I like to imagine the person contemplating that question, that instruction, and saying, my will and my life, that's a lot. I mean, that's kind of everything.
That's pretty much everything.
That's kind of everything.
Yeah.
So, I'll tell you what, let me make a list of everything that I want to turn over. I want to turn over my dreams, my nightmares. I want to turn over my struggles with relationship. I want to turn over my pictures of myself, true and false. I want to... I find that once one has done this thoroughly, you have a pretty good candidate for a 4th step. And you have arrived there on behalf of an agenda that is about willingness. It is about, wait, I want to turn this over. I'm tired of carrying this stuff. You know what? So list. And again, the versions, the people who approach the 4th step, I think most fruitfully, are advised, and I know the AA literature at some point specifically asserts this, to be sure to list character attributes, character assets, as well as deficits. Somewhere in the literature, I believe, is the observation that it would be a foolish merchant who, in doing an inventory, only listed damaged goods. And for me, that point is extremely well taken. So I think that point is established there. What I'm getting at, that gimmick.
Yes, but it strikes me that it's strikingly different than the program that's outlined in the literature.
That's where I was headed. Where there's actually two, in a very broad sense, two versions, if you will, of how to engage with the work of the fourth step. One is found in the original literature, and that would be the AA Big Book. And that, I don't know if we've talked about that history here too much, but the Big Book was written, I believe we did, when there were two people who had 5 years sobriety.
Right.
And yeah, we covered that.
Which is miraculous to start with.
It's absolutely miraculous. And the point I want to make right now is that those people, including the vast majority who had less than 2 years of the original 100 people who were involved at the time of the Big Book writing, those people were very understandably extremely leery of the trickiness of the addictive mentality.
Yes.
Which is constantly looking for loopholes, exceptions, ways to stretch, ways to maneuver,
how can
and so
I
forth.
manipulate this?
Yeah. And so there's a kind of a strictness, a kind of, you just hew to the line here, and not a lot of emphasis on being gentle to yourself or compassionate with yourself. Makes sense to me, and it is one aspect of the work that is essential. In simple language, it could be called self-honesty. But as I know you know, the central device for undertaking to actually write out a fourth step inventory is to encourage people to identify resentments.
Yes.
And I have to say that if I were going to do that AA model for my own sobriety, and I have certainly borrowed richly from AA in doing that work, that would be a deficient guide for me, simply because my personality makeup is not all that wrapped up in resentments. Yeah. Even at my worst, drinking days and so forth, there were a lot of other things going on in my life that lacked integrity and had negative and destructive aspects to them, but I just didn't go around full of resentments for the most part. So that if I'm going to get at my moral failings, my character defects, however you want to language them, we're going to have to find another frame of reference or another way of looking than just resentments. And indeed, we find that 20 years later, that other way of looking entered into the AA literature and became what I think a lot of people consider kind of the other major document of the AA program itself, and that's a book called, as you know, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, which consisted of a series of essays written principally by Bill W. with participation of other fellowship members, elaborating in considerable detail his thoughts and AA's thoughts about the 12 steps and then the 12 traditions, which are very interesting, but aside from what we're talking about, they're about the organization.
They're about how we get along with one another, not about how we recover.
Yes, right, and how we don't fall apart even though we don't tie together. It's a fascinating study.
It is very
But for somebody who's 3 hours or 3 days or 3 months or maybe even 3 years from their last drink, it's just not at the top of their interest. But for someone who is right in the thick of the fourth step, as I'm sure you recall, a frame of reference that is offered in that writing on the fourth step is to use not a list of people you have resentments about, but the 7 deadly sins. Oh, now those I could relate to copiously.
Yes.
And a lot of the work that I do with clients and others who come to me that I just talk to informally about addiction and about the four-step process, I try to do what I call a detoxification process, because that fear has its origins in a fundamental shame belief about oneself. And that so gets in the way of seeing oneself clearly and then being able to bring a compassionate regard into one's self-scrutiny and attempts to make changes where you realize, I really don't want to be in this place. I don't want to be dishonest in these ways. I don't want to be...
And as Brene Brown points out, to accept vulnerability, which shame stands definitely in the way of being vulnerable. I'm glad you cleared that up about resentments, because of that whole shame thing, there is a class of addict, a whole class of addict who takes everything upon self, and it's hard to have resentments when you're taking it all upon yourself. So, because it's all my fault.
Yes, although I would say that the human mind is agile enough that there are actually people out there who manage fairly successful to take it all upon themselves
and still have resentments. I'm sure.
Kind of bifurcate.
But your alternative approach to that fourth step reminds me of a priest I knew who was in recovery, who advised people in Lent, do not give up something that is dear to you in Lent. Give up something you're holding on to that you no longer need nor use.
That's lovely.
Yeah. So, a very interesting approach. So that gives us a pretty good idea of the fourth step. Step 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Now, this sounds an awful lot like confession. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, I think there was an original intent of confession that indeed was wholesome, spiritually sound, and so forth. I don't think there's any philosophy or code of conduct or behavior, thinking, no matter how pristine and meretricious it may be, that hasn't been turned into a set of hard-nosed rules and thoroughly spoiled in the process. Yes. So, is that what the fifth step is intending? I'm quite sure it's not. Is it easily perceived that way? Absolutely, over and over and over. Again, the perspective, the notion of bringing, okay, well, the step that precedes it, what is it up to there? Well, we've got, in this case, it's a fairly transparent relationship operationally. The fourth step was doing the inventory. The fifth step, from my perspective, recognizes a fundamental truth about human process, and that is, I can make lists all the livelong day, and they can be penetratingly insightful and unsparingly honest and so forth and so on. And as long as they're on that list and tucked away in my pocket or in my drawer at home or something like that, they are not real to me.
Yes.
They are not real. Again, the opening word, just like the first step, is admitted. Right?
I'm just going to make sure that that's right.
Please do. I don't want to be bare naked in public.
It is admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs.
And again, I emphasize the version of admitted that isn't, confessed, but that's let in, like we open a door and let in a visitor. So it is in admitting, in sharing it with another, that we let it into ourselves. And that this list then becomes real, and it becomes a description of who we are, not an indictment of who we are. And if we've done it in that fulsome kind of a way, there's a lot of good stuff in there. And I will guarantee that over and over and over, I don't think I've ever met anyone, and I've never been anyone, who doesn't have a much harder time doing a generous treatment of character assets and virtues, if you will, in the happy sense of that word, than the long list of 3,714 ways in which I've been a flaming asshole, And so to do that with fullness can constitute both a kind of letting these awful things become real, and over and over in AA meetings you hear people tell the story about how when I did this step with my sponsor, after I was done, he said, "Oh yeah, well I did stuff," or that kind of it becomes what's the word? Proportional. It's no longer larger than everything.
Yes.
My sins, my badness is larger than everything, and now I just shared it.
It takes the power out of it.
Yeah, I just shared it with somebody, and it's finite. It might be big. If
I shared it with somebody who wasn't even impressed.
If I ran into a school bus and killed 14 children, that's big, and it's not going to stop being big.
Right.
But it stops being infinitely big.
Yeah. So it's not, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." It's
not from my perspective.
Yeah. We're really, as you say, bringing it into a wholeness. It's a piece of the authenticity that you talked about in that two-part summary. So to recognize who we are and then manifest that in some way. So,
well, and the sixth step, is it timely to move on to that?
Absolutely. The sixth step states, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And I'm going to include the seventh step here too, because the seventh step says, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings, which the reason I do that is because it sounds like one step instead of two. And it also sounds kind of like a gimme. If you've done all this other stuff, of course you're ready to do all that.
I hear you, and I don't hear you saying that you think, therefore, it should be 11-step program.
No, not at all. No.
But you point to the intimate dovetailing of those two steps,
right?
Which makes perfect sense, because not to fall in love with this little, two-part construct that I came up with, but there really is that shifting from the first six steps from that recognition, from the agenda of the first six steps, in a sense of ownership of self, to being faithful to self.
Okay. And that unfortunately is where we'll have to pick it up next time, Roget, because we are once again out of time. Thank you very much for this
Casey.
conversation. And thank you for joining us on Come to Think of It. I hope you'll be with us next time. Until then, drive cheerfully. I'm Casey Scott.